Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Stinemetz brothers, and we are the pseudo scholars. This podcast is our schoolhouse, and each week we grapple with our own realities by challenging our own thoughts and exploring stuff that interests us.
We're interested in things like what's the future of space exploration, or the problem behind human suicide, or what makes the New England Patriots so much better than everything else. All of these ideas, we're going to break them down. We're going to challenge conventional thinking, and then hopefully everyone's going to walk away informed, stimulated, and a little bit inspired.
And this week, or in the next 2 weeks, I should say, we're going into a two-part series on the transportation revolution. And what do we mean by the transportation revolution? Well, we're talking about all the exciting, disrupting technologies that are going on around the automobile. Most notably, you'd think about Elon Musk and Tesla at the top of that list. So this week, in part one, we're going to talk about electric vehicles specifically and kind of ask the question, are they here to stay? Discuss the energy debate as much as we need to, and kind of try to get an understanding of how disruptive that technology actually could be for the oil sector. And then in part two, we're going to talk about autonomous cars. So cars that drive themselves and don't require human beings to actually automate them anymore. So how could that change the way we live in cities? And these two parts will coincide in this massive section on transportation revolution.
Right. And this is a topic that hits close to home for Shane and I, because the company that's disrupting all of this, we all know, is Elon Musk and Tesla. And the company that he's disrupting are the ones that are all out here in Houston, Texas, where I live, in Phillips 66. We're the third biggest refiner in North America. So these are all really, really important issues because they matter a lot to the future of our economy, because we have so many oil and gas companies that are absolutely powerful and essential. And everyone knows that providing energy and improving lives is something that is absolutely necessary to the continuation of human life and to the flourishing of different societies. And so for all those reasons, we think this is a valuable topic to tee up.
Yeah, and I think to get started, we should probably talk about why cars or automobiles are so important in American culture. And I think it really has to do with a couple of things. Primarily, we're an enormous country by comparison with most other countries in the world. I think there's like 185 to 250 countries in the world, something like that. And only 4 or something like that are bigger than the United States. So we have a massive, massive country. And economically, one of the great inventions or things that we've done that other countries haven't was initiate an interstate system, a system of connecting cities from the East Coast to the West Coast. We're talking thousands of miles. And so naturally, cars basically epitomized convenience for people to travel, to do commerce. And now the average American family owns 3 cars. It's the second biggest investment in a human's lifetime in the United States. That is cars. People spend tens of thousands of dollars on them every single year, just in maintenance and other expenses. But we've been driving cars since really the beginning of American Industrial Revolution. You know, before the invention of the radio, before women could vote in our country, we've been driving cars. So cars are a huge part of who we are. And naturally, a disruption in the way that cars affect American life is a big deal.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a really, really big deal because it's something that people are engaging in for hours and hours every single week. You know, Shane, I live out here in Houston, Texas. We have one of the most traveled roads in all of America, the 610 loop. When you think about people that are literally spending 10 to 15 hours every single week in their car, when you consider that the average human being is sleeping 7 hours a week, 84 hours or 7 hours a day and 84 hours a week, you're talking about a massive potential improvement in the way that people spend their time every single week, because we're really just not that efficient in this space right now.
Yeah, that's right. And so why is this important? Outside of just the fact that people are driving cars frequently, I think we actually need to talk about the big companies that are going to be affected. You've already mentioned Phillips 66, the company that you're employed by. I mean, oil and gas companies are at the top of every Fortune 500 and Global 500 list for every country in the world. If you go look at the biggest companies in China, they're oil and gas companies. You look in the United States, outside of maybe Apple and Walmart, you're going to find a list of oil and gas companies. And oil and gas companies have one real primary customer, and it's the transportation section or sector. So those are car companies. You know, those are the Hondas and the Fords and the Chevrolets of the world. They're enormous companies. And electric vehicles pose a big threat to those oil and gas companies because obviously they want to provide the energy power for those cars. Electric cars wouldn't be powered by oil and gas. So it makes, simple sense here to think that electric vehicles could potentially pose a massive threat to the major oil and gas companies, and ultimately could lead to the diminishment of the influence of oil and gas companies. What I've said are like the largest companies in the world today.
Yeah, well, and just to key on that point a little bit, they're going to diminish. They're not going to disappear, at least not for the very long foreseeable future. There's a lot of things that oil and gas companies do that people might not completely recognize, but I'm sure there's parts of this wire right here that's made from petroleum products. But you're completely right. The majority of their revenue is all comes from motor fuels, right? From diesel and gasoline. That's the way that all refineries work. They try to generate the highest profit by optimizing around which space is generating the biggest margin in the market. So it's definitely going to be an interruption. And let me tell you, some of those guys are not guys that are going to take interruption very lightly. And we've seen that oil companies not only hold a substantial amount of power in the world, but also in the United States. And it is a political game as well. We've seen several big oil guys, that's what we call them, appointed to massive offices in the United States. So it's going to be a really, really interesting thing to see how Tesla and Mercedes and some of these other companies disrupt the supply chain that the oil companies have been providing for, 100 years or something like that?
Right. No, that's well said. And I think that's something that we want to get into, Cade, because potentially you and I sit on different sides of the argument here, or at least we're going to probably have a little bit of controversy in terms of timeline. You know, there's
Right.
people out there saying that this is going to disrupt big oil tomorrow and change is coming and all these big oil companies are going to crash. And then there's perhaps the realist, or there's the folks that are on the other side of the fence that are thinking, hold on now, we need energy to power commerce. And right now, oil does a pretty good job of it. So we can get into the issues a little bit more, but I think it's pretty cool. Like as we start to debate, you know, the position of the electric vehicle and its comparable technology, the internal combustion engine, which is what we're doing with right now. So the internal combustion engine came around. I think the very first one evolved in like 1908, and so that's the Model T. That's Henry Ford, and he was able to scale the internal combustion engine by building essentially a moving assembly line. And so because of that scalability factor, the internal combustion engine beat out its big rival. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about. But in the late 19th century, Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison both believed that the electric car was quieter, cleaner, and more economical in comparison to its brother, the internal combustion engine. But the reality is that those two brilliant scientists probably missed the economical part. Because of the moving assembly line, the Model T was able to become scalable much quicker, and naturally, that's the car that we know about today. And it wasn't until really the last decade that the electric vehicle has made a bit of a comeback.
Yeah, Shane, I want to speak to that point a little bit, because the fact that the concept of electric vehicles has been around for a really, really long time, like you said, it was a race to the market, so to speak, and Henry Ford winning that and figuring out how to make it scalable, which really just gave it economies of scale, which is just a fancy term for the more we produce, the cheaper it gets, what makes it better exponentially over time, is what's kept oil and gas companies and the internal combustion engine around for so long. But because what Henry Ford was able to do was shove a giant boulder a little ways forward, and then the brilliance of the American economy is that when there's an opportunity to make a buck, some of the smartest minds ever are going to come in and try to figure out how to advance this topic. And so that's something that I think that no matter where you stand on which side of the aisle, and maybe if it's affecting your pocketbook or what you think about environmental issues, there's no doubt that what Elon Musk has done is pushed forward a giant boulder that no one thought could be pushed forward. And now some of these automakers that are, let's be honest, are much better at making cars than Tesla is at this point in the game, are going to develop that kind of technology. And it really seems like it's really more of a matter of time because of some of those things that you talked about. The cleaner, it's a little more efficient, and it could be cheaper long term, no doubt about it.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to look into the technology a little bit. Like, people don't necessarily know, unless you're an engineer or you're interested in mechanics of an engine, how an engine actually works and what goes into running a car. But it's actually a little bit crazy to think that these cars have been around now for 110 years or so, and they haven't really advanced in terms of their technology. That is the technology of the internal combustion engine. The exact same process takes place. And it's a little bit wild to think about. Basically, you have a series of hot explosions inside cylinders that are pushing pistons back and forth, and those pistons are moving metal bars, which ultimately turn the wheels. And then as a result, they send out billowing smoke out of a tailpipe. So not a lot of technological advancement since 1908 with the internal combustion engine.
Oh, right. Absolutely not. Nothing's been changed fundamentally about the engine. What we have seen happen is greater efficiencies and improvements around the technologies over time, which is really important because if we're both in agreement that this is not a matter of if, but when companies like Tesla and Mercedes put a substantial dent into these big automakers and oil and gas companies' pockets, it's really not a matter of if, but when. So the question is, how quickly can they economize these things and get them scalable, because the fact of the matter is the automakers have addressed a lot of the big issues with the internal combustion engine in terms of how it affects my pocketbook. Because if you remember, back in the early 2000s when gas was at $5 a gallon in a lot of places, you saw car sales go down tremendously, especially on large SUVs and trucks. Now you have a truck that has better gas mileage than the Camry did 40 years ago or something like that. So they've gotten moderately better as Tesla has taken giant leaps forward in just a matter of years.
Right. Okay, well, let's speak to the American family then who's thinking, hey, what's the problem? I can buy, a Honda Civic for a very reasonable price. And for that matter, I could even go out and buy a truck and an SUV, and at $2 a gallon in the state of Texas, I'm assuming that's about the cost of gas these days. Right. It seems pretty affordable to me. What's the big deal? There are a couple big deals. So I think the first one to talk about, just in terms of comparing the technologies, the electric vehicle with the internal combustion engine, the first one is just inefficiency. And I think it's interesting to think that Morgan Stanley, the giant bank, considers the automobile the world's most underutilized asset. So about 80 cents of every dollar that's spent on gasoline is wasted in inefficiencies. So those 80 cents aren't used effectively because a good portion of the energy is just not being used efficiently. I can't speak to the science of it specifically, but this is what Morgan Stanley claims to be a fact. The most inefficient use of any particular tool in the United States right now is the automobile.
Right. Well, and that's obviously something that everyone, again, no matter on which side of the aisle that you stand, that's not something that's good. We don't settle for that in a lot of other areas of technology. And just when you look at the way that the oil and gas industry has developed, namely the greatest businessman that's ever lived, Rockefeller building his big monopoly, you can tell that there may even purposely have not been the same kind of technological advances so that we could stay in this type of technology, even though all these problems exist, and we're sitting here saying, why is it taking 100 years to fix this stuff?
Yeah, and there are a few more issues. So let's talk about the dangers to not only human health, but also to the environment. So let's start with human health. This is one potential argument. The tailpipes are basically emitting toxins and particulates. These are waste-type particulates that are going out into the atmosphere. And if MIT is right, they are predicted that about 53,000 Americans are dying prematurely each year because of vehicle pollution. So those are human beings who would live longer lives if there wasn't for vehicle pollution in the air. So there's these indirect environmental effects that people don't necessarily take into effect. So those are the effects on human health. And then there's the effects on the environment, which is much more controversial. This is the stuff that's in the news on a regular basis. And there seems to be a very hard-lined argument from the left versus the right. Climate change is real and humans are causing it, and it's caused by the transportation sector. And then there's kind of the other side of the argument, which might say that either climate change isn't real, or it's just not caused by humans to the same degree, or there's just nothing we can do to actually influence it at this point. Kind of there's no turning back. There's a number of different arguments there. But what we know is true is that like 83% of carbon emissions in the world are coming from automobiles. So if carbon pollution is going out into the atmosphere and causing CO2 levels to raise, and therefore the temperature to raise, if climate change is real, there is the potential, or there is a huge group of scientists who are arguing from the National Science Foundation that it's caused by petroleum-based products, i.e. the automobile.
Right. No, I mean, you're highlighting a lot of different areas. And if the environment's not enough to get us fired up about some of the negative effects of the internal combustion engine, and really not the engine so much as our devotion to powering that engine through petroleum products and not having an alternate source of fuel, one of the biggest arguments for getting away from this is fact that we have a globalized economy and that different countries have tons and tons of power and influence based on their geographic location. Do they happen to be sitting on top of a big old pot of black gold, right? And we've seen all these countries in the Middle East that obviously America would have a lot of existential differences in the way that they run their countries. But I know that our company in particular, Phillips 66, I think we buy over 600,000 barrels of oil every single day from the Saudi Arabians. So we are drastically dependent on lots of other companies. And so this energy independence that we've talked about, and it has been helped by the shale revolution inside of the United States with oil and gas, you can see that getting away from that to a source of renewable energy would be really, really good in terms of our political differences that we have from other folks, and hopefully regimes that have been powered by this. And terrorist organizations that are really controlled by this random source of energy, we might see some decay in those kind of institutions.
Yeah, I think most institutional organizations that would be considering the ethical and moral ramifications of doing business with certain entities, like the Saudi Arabian government, would say that's not the kind of business we want to be in. We don't want to be in bed with the Saudis. And right now, there are additional national security risks that are brought on by our dependency on oil. So that's one potential argument. But the bottom line is that oil is cheap, and right now 94% of the world's transportation runs on petroleum. So is there a legitimate contender to disrupt the field? Could the electric vehicle change the ball game?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question. So we've talked a little bit about just some of the kind of foundational parts of the internal combustion engine. So now let's get to the electric car, and what is it that Tesla and companies like that are doing. So basically, an alternating current induction motor works as electricity, so it's powered by electricity and is passed through a stationary outer shell, which causes like a rotor. It kind of looks like a hot dog to rotate and turn the wheel and the axle. And so that's kind of how the mechanism works. So it's powered by electricity as opposed to burning fossil fuels in those small explosions, controlled explosion chain that you talk about happening there, generating the piston movement. The electric vehicle really works in a totally different way. And so some of the benefits of that are that it's faster. I mean, if you've ever ridden a golf cart, you can test this right now. When you put your foot on the pedal of a electric golf cart versus a gas golf cart, you get way quicker acceleration, which is pretty exciting when you think about the performance of the car. But then, of course, all the other big things that we're talking about. It's cleaner. It's much better for the environment. You don't have the same number of tailpipe emissions. It's quieter. But at this case, unfortunately, the biggest hindrance to it is it's just less economical right now, Shane, right? Oil's just really cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is where the discussion really can begin for us now that we've done a bit of the background. Now it's really time to talk about what's going on today with Tesla and Elon Musk, and is there truly an electric vehicle revolution that's taking place before our eyes, and what are the effects of it? So we know about Tesla, they make these fancy sedans, but on top of the fact that they are the first real car startup in the last 100 years to have any success in the industry, nobody could disrupt Chrysler and GM and some of the big automakers in the United States and Ford until now. This is really the first case. But now we're seeing a car company, a car startup that has a market cap of $50 billion, which has just eclipsed the market cap of Ford. So I assume that makes it the largest market cap of any American car manufacturer in the world. So that is the value that investors are putting on the label of Tesla. They suspect big things are coming. And the Tesla is the top selling luxury sedan in the world now, even in comparison to the big luxury competitors like Audi, like Mercedes, and the European cars. But the bottom line is that from an efficiency standpoint and just from the overall capabilities of the Car and Driver magazine have rated it the best car ever made. So that's where we stand, Cade, with the Tesla. But the reality is that it's all about battery technology. Battery technology right now just is not good enough for us to achieve that economical plateau in which the electric vehicle becomes of the same or lesser value than the internal combustion engine.
Right. And that's the whole point. I studied economics in college, and it gets me a little bit fired up every time we talk about this technology stuff, but it only matters to the extent that the laws of economics start to work out for the place. It's just the way that our world works and the way that it should work, I think. And I think we're going to see really good things from a system like that. And again, you and I don't doubt that in 100 years, everything's going to be powered by electricity, and hopefully it'll be solar because it's the most abundant source of energy in the world. That'd be great to be able to pull from that. But that is a big point. I think one statistic I'd like to throw out there to just kind of chew on for people a little bit is the Energy Information Association, or agency, I should say, which is a government agency, and the government subsidizes Tesla. So they very much so are interested in that, right? The government internalizes the costs that individuals don't. So the cost of the environment, that's why we believe the government should care for the greater need when individuals don't, so called a market failure. So they're obviously very interested in it. So I have a hard time understanding this statistic, but basically 82% of the world's energy right now is from petroleum products, 82%. And by 2040, and this was a study done in 2015, so it's a little bit dated, but it's not too old, only has that number going down 2% to 80% in 2040. So part of that is due to the fact that energy demands from the global economy are going to grow 50% by 2040. So not only is it not quite economical right now, but it's also not scalable. Tesla's still figuring out, how do we make cars? How do we do just kind of the assembly line type of thing really, really well? And we still see some gaps right now that would lend me to the notion that it's going to be a little time, although they are going to start pressing in and taking a bigger slice of the pie with every day.
Right. Well, there is one major evolution that's taken place in the scalability of the Tesla or the electric vehicle, and that's, as we talked about, the battery and the manufacturing of batteries. So most people, progress that Elon's made, would know about the Tesla battery factory that's being manufactured right now out in Nevada. It's outside of Reno. And the whole stimulus of the economy outside of Reno has been fantastic because Elon has kind of become the largest producer of the lithium-ion battery in the entire world. Another great statistic about the building, Cade, I don't know if you've heard this one, but the building itself will have the largest footprint of any facility in the world. It is the new largest building in the world.
Wow. Wow.
So wrap your head around that. And then he's going to exponentially grow the amount of lithium ion batteries that are being produced every year. And so the idea is to drastically shrink costs. And so this is where I'm going to assume that government organization might not be taking into account the capabilities and the scalabilities of the electric car. In 2015, if that's when the report came out, the battery plant certainly hadn't even broken ground, or if it hadn't really been popularized at that point. So we've come a few years now, and now the battery price has dropped 70%, or sorry, I'd say the battery is about 70% of the total vehicle's value, and the prices in the batteries have dropped 35% just since the construction of the Elon battery factory. But the battery factory isn't even at full capacity yet. So by 2022, some of the electric vehicle experts, I saw it posted in Bloomberg once, say the cost of the electric car will then exceed, or rather achieve, the same cost of the internal combustion engine. So the standard Honda Civic should cost the same as the Chevy Volt by 2022, according to some comparisons. So if that's true, I kind of wonder what that statistic that that governmental energy agency is coming up with. You know, they said that was a worldwide energy statistic. So I'm sure that in countries, specifically the developing world, where cars are still being manufactured at lower specs, and I wouldn't suspect that electric vehicles are coming anytime soon in, I don't know, like sub-Saharan Africa or regions of Southeast Asia or something along those lines. But in the United States, I think we've got a different ballgame on our hands.
Oh, no, I think you're completely right. And the amount of variables that go in, that take place, that could change how quickly we move towards this are so many, it's almost incalculable. I mean, politically, there's a huge ramification for electing a more conservative government that might, lower subsidies on kind of in investments into alternate forms of energy like Tesla. If we have another huge oil crisis and oil goes down to $10 a barrel, I mean, I think the suppressed prices in the oil industry actually have slowed the growth towards the electric vehicle substantially, because this was almost talked about a little bit more several years ago when oil was at such a high price, because people are thinking with their wallets, right? That's when I'm going to go out and buy a Tesla, is when I can't afford to fill my truck up for $80 every single week. So those are some issues. So it's obviously very hard to predict those. And I have seen the same statistics about the ion batteries. But I would also say this: the oil companies are not full of a bunch of dummies. They're just not. not only are they not going to give up their power and their influence easily, and there's a lot of it, they can synthetically adjust the markets to suit their needs. We know that they've done that. I mean, OPEC is a freaking cartel, globally. So we know that they have that kind of influence and power, but also I think they see the writing on the wall, so to speak. Now, they may disagree with timeline, but I can tell you there's not been a refinery, a large-scale refinery, to refine petroleum products and make them into diesel and gasoline since 1970. So the oil and gas companies realize that there's going to be a limit to what we can do, especially in developed countries in this space. And so you see a lot of them moving towards what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is the energy source that might bridge the gap between full-blown electric technology, or actually help electric technology, and where we're at today with mainly petroleum products. And that is natural gas.
Well, so what role could natural gas play in the passenger automobile? Because today, when you go and fill up at the pump, you're putting 100% petroleum product into your car. So we know that natural gas, on a scale in terms of total environmental effects, seems to be cleaner than petroleum, which seems to be a little bit cleaner than coal. Coal being the worst, petroleum being the second worst, and then natural gas kind of coming in as the best and most effective fossil fuel of the three in terms of cleanliness. So what role could it play in the automobile?
So there's a lot of big trucks now. If you see a lot of trucks now that are run on compressed natural gas. And so they're finding other ways to develop this technology. And people are talking about potentially getting these into 18-wheelers, things like that, especially companies that are incentivized to look at alternate forms of fuel, because natural gas is really, really cheap. It's actually hurt the oil and gas companies like mine that do a lot of natural gas processing, but they're looking for those kind of alternate forms of energy. Whereas I would expect that the electric vehicle is primarily driven towards the regular, sedan. But then how long is it going to take we need to get that technology into trucks or SUVs or things like that. And although it's probably the big work is just getting into the sedan, there are other things that are really, really cheap right now that might be encourageable for big transportation companies to take advantage of right now. But like you said, it is a lot cleaner. It's already naturally occurring, but also we use natural gas to generate electricity. So natural gas is a much better way to generate electricity than coal. So the fossil fuel industry might have some kind of play into generating the electricity that's ultimately going to power all these electric vehicles, because that's really the other part of the equation for Musk, right, Shane?
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's where the argument to me becomes quite legitimate quickly in defense of the oil companies pivoting and shifting to a newer form of energy outside of petroleum-based products. Because I'm not seeing any cars right now that are being manufactured to run on natural gas. The cars that we're seeing today, the big revolution in car manufacturing, if you look at the way that the big manufacturers are investing their money, companies like Mercedes and Audi, not just Tesla, they're investing their money in electric cars. I think these guys are the biggest indicator of what's coming. And the fact that Mercedes is now spending more money in research and development on the electric vehicle than they are on their particular fast, fancy sedan line that runs on the internal combustion engine and petroleum products tells a lot.
Oh, yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And you can just look at where people are spending their money and know where they think the future is going, right? People are voting every day. That's what we're doing. We're building export facilities along the Gulf to export propane and kerosene and other types of things to China and places like that where we can get bigger arbitrage, because we know that eventually this thing is going to go away. Now, I want to narrow in a little bit more on what are some factors that could lead us towards understanding what particular time these kind of electric vehicles could really explode, because it seems like we might be on the precipice of the big technology burst. But there's a couple of big things that I think we need to point out. Number one is that the average age of a vehicle on the road today is 11.4 years. So we refer to that in the industry as the fleet. So how long is it going to take for the fleet to turn over? And we've actually, oil and gas companies have heard a lot from the greater efficiencies that hybrids and even these trucks that aren't getting 10 miles to the gallon anymore, that's really, really hurt our sales for sure. So it's only gotten worse and worse and worse. So if the average age is 11.4 years, then you're expecting that every single year that the automakers are holding on to their last big piece of the puzzle, you're going to have a significant amount of time before you see a real turnaround in that fleet. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that as amazing as Tesla is, they're not making money right now. Their stock price is all about discounted future cash flows, right? So no one thinks Tesla's making money today. No one's betting on Tesla today. They're betting on Tesla tomorrow. They think
Right.
that Tesla's
They're betting on Tesla's ability to produce a car that achieves what it was been trying to achieve since day one, which is about a $30,000 kind of mid-range car. It seems a little bit excessive to me. I don't buy cars at $30,000, but
right.
a $30,000 mid-range car is what everybody's betting on. It's the Tesla 3 or whatever it's called, and it's supposed to be coming out into production at the end of next year. And that's where all these back orders came in. That's where the big cash flow came. And that's where the big bump in the stock prices come and the bump in the market share. So you're absolutely right, Cade. I mean, these are investors who are placing their bets on the electric vehicle, on Tesla and Elon Musk. But I think it's really critical to think about the fact that Tesla is just sort of the leading cause. Elon Musk says all the time that it was really his vision to shift or disrupt the sector and then hopefully encourage all the big guys to come along, the big power players, the guys with all the money, the big car companies that we've been talking about. But to your point, what does the timeline truly look like? That's a question that we should probably discuss a little bit. Do you think that there's a role for the government to play in subsidizing or involving itself in the transition to electric vehicles?
I love, Shane, I was in Boston this past weekend and spent a little time at Harvard and MIT and talking to some PhD environmental engineers. And it's really, really exciting that we have the type of structure that we would literally pay. The government would grant people money to just sit in the lab all day and try to figure out how can we improve life in 50 years from now. So I believe that is money well spent. I really, really do. But I also believe that we have to have cheap, affordable, accessible energy for the majority of the world to continue to develop. I mean, the US is a trendsetter, no doubt about it, but there's still gonna be massive amounts of people that still need to get to work, that still need to get wherever they're needing to go. And transportation is one of the most key problems. So even though people look so negatively on the oil and gas industry because of their output on the environment, what would we have done for the last 20 years if we didn't have this? I want people to see this as the evolution of the industry. And so as soon as it becomes economical, I'm all for that. But I do think that today we need to make sure that we're not synthetically oppressing oil and gas companies that are providing a service that everyone's willing to exchange. And that's the direction that we're going. So I would have us some kind of balanced approach to live in the tension of trying to be 20 years from now, and I'm not saying that it's 20 years, but also trying to keep us stuck in the 1920s with this internal combustion engine. I'm more of a hands-off guy, but I don't mind the subsidies that the government's giving Tesla, because ultimately I think it's going to be good for your lungs and my lungs. But I also think it's going to be great for our pocketbooks in 20 years from now.
Agree. I mean, we've talked about how the potential for the electric vehicle to be more efficient, to be cleaner, even to be more economical once battery technology keeps up, and we really manage ways of storing energy. That's the big challenge right now. If we could store solar energy and batteries for longer periods of time, we wouldn't have a problem. But that is another topic for another day. But to go back to the government discussion, Cade, I really struggle with this one. I saw that the Swedish government has now just committed to get all of their internal combustion engines off the road and to be like totally energy sufficient on wind and solar by like 2030 or something like that. And obviously that's a big government play. They're heavily involved in that. But that's because the scientists and the government officials and general public belief in the country of Sweden is that CO2 emissions emitted out of the tailpipes of 1995 Hondas that are driving around on the road right now are actually doing a lot more damage than perhaps we're leading on right now in the discussion. Neither of us have kind of come at this particularly hard line from the climate change perspective. But if climate change scientists are correct, and it's an overwhelming majority that now believe that carbon emissions, man-made emissions, are influencing our environment and that our environment won't be sustainable for 100 years at the current rate. If those facts are true, then I think the government absolutely has a role to play. The science gets a little bit tricky. This is where things become a lot more controversial.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously you and I are both not scientists, but I did learn a little bit in economics about causality versus correlation, and not at all trying to say that there's not causality between CO2 emissions and the temperature of the earth. But it is when you're doing science in an uncontrolled environment and you can't control for certain variables, it becomes a very, very challenging to quiet out other different patterns that could be going on that we might not even know about. I mean, we're in a tiny little ball of dust that's hovering around the sun in a massive solar system in a massive universe. So I guess my approach is always to be just fairly skeptical, because we have seen the scientific community kind of go up and down on what temperature the Earth is correlating with and things like that. Like I remember back in the 1980s, reading back in the 1980s, we were worried about the next ice age and things like that. So not at all just discounting that 97% of scientists agree that CO2 is affecting the temperature of the Earth. I do think the implications are a little bit challenging. And what I would worry about as a more conservative person, and I think you would commiserate this a little bit, is that we've seen times where the government wants to seize a little bit more control than maybe they need to in order to proliferate government, because that's what governments do. So I don't know. It's a tough tension to live in between. But I think that tomorrow people in Sweden still need to get to work. And if they can't buy an electric vehicle, I think they need a way to get to work. And if that's a petroleum-powered car, then I think I'm for that. So it's very challenging, but this is an ethics discussion, right? I feel like we're in philosophy 101 in college.
There is a degree of that. I'm just going to go into the climate science just a bit more because I feel like we wouldn't be doing our due diligence if we didn't at least share what common thinking is amongst the scientific community says today. So this is based off of ice drilling technologies. So these are technologies that are measuring temperatures of ice and trying to predict change or identify change over the course of time. And I don't know enough about the science to say whether it's legitimate or not, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so it's an IPCC, it's a group of 1,300 independent scientists from all around the world, initially sponsored by the United Nations. But these guys are saying that 90% of CO2 increased emissions are caused by human activity. So what we've seen is that the temperature has gone up 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at the charts, I can't share the screen right now, but if you see the way that the curve looks, prior to the Industrial Revolution, based off of graphs that are looking at ice drilling technology, the spike after the Industrial Revolution is incredibly obvious. It's the hockey stick.
Right.
So things changed when we started producing, basically since we really learned to harvest fire. That's really where the Industrial Revolution came from. We learned to use fire to do the things that we needed it to do to produce energy. But by doing so, we were emitting fossil fuels that were burning up into the ozone. Okay, so anyways, if this temperature spike is real, then I'm not surprised to see that an entire nation like Sweden would take a huge stance like this. But let's get back to the economics of it all, Cade. I mean, that leaves the one big question is, when would the electric vehicle become affordable for the average American?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously what we can't predict is Elon Musk deciding to turn out tomorrow, raise a bunch of money and top himself and build another lithium-ion battery manufacturing facility and find ways to scale the economies even better. But I'm all for that, right? Elon Musk, do your thing. I just think in the meantime, it's very challenging. I mean, it's a very challenging argument. I think we're probably looking at, if I had to give my best estimate, we're looking at 15 years. In 15 years, I could see electric vehicles being between 30 and 50% of the number of cars that are driven. Because I want to remind everyone right now, here's a key statistic: 473 internal combustion engines to every one electric vehicle. So that's a very massive proportion. I mean, think about it, 473 cars to one. And remember that average age of the fleet is 11 years. And I got to remind people about sales and automakers. I mean, they're not doing phenomenally. They're improving a little bit because the economy is improving. But Ford and GM combined at $300 billion in sales last year to Tesla's $7 billion. So I know that these guys are going to get on the board, and I know that technology can advance really quickly. But one of my big questions is, we're not quite talking about the technology of an iPhone, right? That's limited cost. We're talking about a $30,000 piece of technology. So to me, I asked the question, is it reasonable to accept kind of slower, more moderate change comparatively to like really quick technologies that can get on the internet and soar overnight,
Those are all rational arguments. I appreciate your rationality. I still kind of think that there's two major schools of thought here. There is the school of thought that's maybe based in the OPEC camp, and OPEC's most recent study or most recent publication says that they're kind of in agreement with that energy study that you talked about earlier. They're saying by 2040, electric vehicles will still only be 1% of all cars. So that's a big overarching statement. If that is true, basically all of this is for nothing. Basically, we're wasting our time with this podcast right now because big change isn't happening. Whereas MIT says in a department-wide publication that they're calling 2020 the decade that electric cars are going to take over. And there's an article that people can go onto MIT's website and read about. So, there's kind of two different schools of thought here. You get the industrial winners in this department who are speaking boldly about how slow this technology is going to take to shift and take over. And then there's those that kind of in the scientific community, maybe in the technology community, that are saying it's coming faster, it's going to have a bigger impact, and it's critically important. But these two sides are going to clash. And I think we're going to see warfare. I mean, I think we are going to see all-out warfare. To say that the oil companies are going to roll over and die is a misnomer. They might adjust. They might pivot. But do you think they're willing to give up their profits to these little electric car companies? I think not.
Yeah, I don't think so in the short term. And I think that's the thing that everyone has to remember is how powerful oil is. I mean, it's absolutely incredible globally, the kind of influence that these guys have, the lobbyists in Washington that they have. And so I just think that kind of natural change driven totally by economics is going to take some time, even if it was just a purely economical argument. But you have the political argument that you also have to weigh in. And you have the fact, here's something that you pointed out earlier that I think is really, really interesting, right? Why are people driving electric cars today? They're driving electric cars because they're super rich and they're forward thinking, right? That's who drives electric cars today, right? For the most part, or drives a Tesla because it's so expensive. Now the average Joe Blow consumer that's not a techie and not a car person, not just a performance vehicle, because I think Tesla outperforms all the internal combustion engines, so people would buy it for that reason. The average Joe that's not going to spend $30,000 on a car. Just think about every single person that buys cars that's going to spend less than $18,000 on a car. They have zero options in the electric vehicle space. So I don't have the numbers on me, Shane, but I could imagine that it wouldn't be wild to say half of the cars that are on the road today people purchased in exchange for $18,000 or less. So the question is, how much more does battery technology need to get to affect those people? So that's why I'm kind of sitting more on that 30 to 50% number in 15 years, because it seems like all those things mounted up against each other are going to be challenging to overcome. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not rooting for it, but it just seems like, Sears is still in business. That's something everyone needs to remember. Sears is still in. Yeah, they're almost dead. They're almost dead. I totally get that. But my point is just that sometimes the life cycle, these things really slow up. Amazon's going to put brick and mortar stores out of business. How long is it going to take? It's tough to say. I think we're dealing with a similar argument here, except for the economics are on Amazon's side. They're not quite yet on Tesla's side. They're moving that direction, but that remains to be seen.
And there needs to be a little bit of hand-holding from my perspective, because I do tend to think that this is a little bit more significant of a challenge to humanity from an environmental perspective, which is probably part of the reason I'm on the bandwagon to get this going a little faster. But I should share, Cade, with you about the situation in California, where electric vehicles are as affordable as regular automobiles now. You can go and buy a Chevy or a Nissan Leaf and get the government subsidy and get the little pushbacks that you get. And by the time that you've not paid for the cost of maintaining an oil, by the time you've paid for not refueling your car every single week, after about 1 year, it shows that a Nissan Leaf will be cheaper than buying a brand new car of similar capacity in the oil side of the house. So that's one example.
Yeah, and I would fully expect for the electric vehicle to become much, much, much more economical in forward-thinking developing countries. So if you look at California, the more forward-thinking progressive part of the country, I mean, I think that's a trend that we're going to see. But how long is it going to take for people in Ohio to start buying electric cars? I guess I'm just trying to taper a little bit of the expectation with some of this, what seems to me some realities. But hey, Shane, I want to kind of drive on this point a little bit just because the challenge a little bit, right? So we're both challenging each other. I come from the oil and gas industry. I'm not going to work here forever. You're more of a technology guy. So we're bringing our ideas together and testing them out. Let's see what the points have to say about it, see where the evidence leads. But one thing I think is interesting is there's an article by Nathan Weiss on Seeking Alpha, right, which is a big analyst company that looks at different stocks and write articles about what you should invest in and things like that. And he did a 6,500 word expose on a scientific study of CO2 emissions. conclusion, and I'm not a scientist, neither are you, so we'd have to read it and we have to find some scholars to vet it a little bit for us. But his conclusion is that Tesla is really only kind of a moderate improvement in terms of CO2 grams per CO2 emitted per mile or per kilowatt of energy than, like, say, a Honda Civic hybrid right now. So one thing I think is also interesting is how Tesla is using their brilliant marketing called zero emissions, right? Or we've got a guy at work that drives a Tesla. It says CO2 LOL, right? It's like, okay, that's pretty funny. But the fact of the matter is we're looking at a whole supply chain when it comes to cars, right? We're not looking at just tailpipe emissions. And so a few things that make Tesla still a fossil fuel requiring company is the fact that these lithium ion batteries require a ton. They're a very tough manufacturing process that releases a good bit of carbon into the air. The other thing is their aluminum bodies. I mean, aluminum wasn't discovered till the 1800s. It's not just naturally occurring. You have to burn aluminum and mold it together and things like that in order to build the body of these Teslas. And then lastly is the big question is the electricity, because we're really only as good as our ability to generate electricity. So in Kentucky, where it's primarily coal-driven industry, a Tesla is actually a pretty dirty vehicle, maybe compared to a Civic out on the East Coast or something like that. So it's just something that's interesting that Tesla is really fun to gravitate around in terms of emissions, but really they're not doing away with fossil fuels altogether, which maybe we need to just take this little tangent right on to the generation of electricity, because that is Tesla's argument.
All right, you brought out some good points. I was hoping you weren't going to go into the most controversial topic, or at least the best challenge to Tesla. And that's certainly the fact that Tesla's just as dirty, or Tesla's dirty too. I've seen some of those campaigns. And naturally, Tesla's responded with some of their own propaganda. I looked at some scholarly articles as well, Cade, and there was one recurring number that I saw. It was 61%. So in the United States, if you account for the way that energy is produced in all 50 states, and then you were to take an equal number of electric vehicles as there are proportionate to the number of people in that state and did a comparison, the electric vehicle would be 61% of the emission of an internal combustion engine. So there's an improvement by 40%, which doesn't seem nearly as dramatic as people say. It's as if you go and buy the Tesla, you drive it off the lot. I've been for a private tour of the Tesla factory. It's like the coolest thing ever. You actually go and pick up your car there. You know, people fly in from Switzerland and they go and they drive their car off. They go and drive it straight onto a ship and ship it back to Switzerland or whatever the heck. It's a really cool place. But you think you're going to drive off the lot and all of a sudden you're saving the environment. You're onto something there, Cade. You're right. There are still emissions. So I think the big movement is that we need to get away from coal-powered electricity. Now, coal makes up a much smaller percentage of America's electricity than it did 50 years ago. So I think it's actually only 39% of electricity, if my notes are correct. It's only 39%, and that's going down. And in states like California, it's predominantly natural gas. States like Kentucky, you're right, very high coal. But that's, I think, why there's a more built-up challenge that's not just in the side of the electric vehicle. We have to think about the way that electricity is coming into our homes. And so naturally, that's why Solar City came around. There's no surprise or coincidence that Solar City and Tesla have just merged. It's one company now. So the idea is that an American family can buy their Tesla, they can park it in their garage, outside of their home or inside of their home, which is powered by Solar City tiles, which are basically solar energies that are being pumped into the house. And so you should have an entirely independent home. Now, these are the 1%ers living in those homes, but I think you're right to think about this situation outside of just the automobile space.
Yeah. And I guess my point is simply just that it's an improvement. That's what Tesla is. It's not a disappearing of fossil fuels. It's not the answer to our energy crisis. It is a great step forward, which is the step that we need to take. And everyone will take that step at their own time. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of American freedom. Now, where the government has some opportunities to influence, I'm fine with them influencing. I would be totally against them outlawing internal combustion engine cars. I'm totally for them being pro renewable energies and giving subsidies and things like that. So it's a problem that we all, I think at the end of the day, no matter which side of the aisle we're on, should be rooting for Elon Musk, so to speak.
That's well said. I mean, it's 2017 now. If Bloomberg news is correct, and if by 2020 the electric vehicle can go up to 500 miles and it costs the same amount as the base level car, a petroleum-based car, somewhere around $22,000, then I think we could start to see a massive, massive shift. How long it's going to take for that shift to take place, and whether it takes place at all, is yet to be seen. But I'm certainly rooting for it. I'm glad to hear you are. I was surprised to hear that a bit.
Well, I'm pro change. I'm pro change. I don't mind taking my check from the big oil companies. It's a nice check for now, but I think I can sit here with a legitimate mind. But I'm not saying this is the future because it's clean energy. That's not why I'm saying it. It's the future because it's clean energy and it's becoming economical. And that's got to be the intersection of our world. We have to live in the practical reality of resourceful constraints. And then also, in the philanthropic kind of mindset of what do we do and how do we best steward the earth that we live on. So I'm all for that. And I think that natural gas can play a big role in generating a lot of this electricity. I don't think we necessarily need to unpack it, but how electricity is generated in a lot of states is actually monopolistic and regulated by the government. So it's going to be really interesting how the government fires their own energy producers in order to allow for solar energy to be something that takes off and expands and proliferates to a bunch of different states. But kind of an interesting idea right there.
Yeah, solar is the next big challenge. To win solar is to win the energy game entirely. And we don't even need Tesla. We can get solar-powered cars probably.
Right. And that's the moderate improvement that we're looking for. But this is something that makes America beautiful, that it's going to be our country that's going to do the primary work in this space to generate this. And it's an environment like the American capitalistic state that allows for a guy like Elon Musk to move over here from Australia or New Zealand or wherever he came from, go to school at University of Pennsylvania and figure out how to get the ball rolling on answers to some of the questions that we probably haven't paid enough attention to as we got a little bit comfortable. But this is a dynamic and changing world. And I fully expect that in order for us to be successful as a country and to continue in our ways, we have to be dynamic and we have to be able to change, but we have to continue to do the things that have made us great for a really, really long time. And it's really, really great, regardless of where you stand, for someone to go and put $20 of gasoline into their car and be able to drive 500 miles. That's still an unbelievable thing. It's still a really good proportion of energy to cost. So I'm for that. And one little statistic that you brought up that's really interesting, because when you think about that 1% number that OPEC, right? OPEC, I'm not really sure we can trust that number at all. But that 1% number would require the proportion to go to 1 to 100, right? That's 1%. We're at 1 to almost 500 right now. So it's actually interesting because comparatively, that's actually still a substantial change. Now, obviously, I think it's going to be more than that, which tells you how amazing the technology is growing. But even that itself is unbelievable.
Agreed completely. I think to summarize, Henry Ford and the Model T has had its day. That 100 years of being the first country to really revolutionize automobile and passenger transportation has made America the most powerful economy in the world. You can't segregate our success with oil and gas, but I'm kind of proud to think that there's companies like Tesla, and proud to think that even the major American companies like Ford's Motor Company, the car company named after him, are considering future technologies to get us away from, dirtier oil-based technologies and moving into like a more efficient and sustainable method.
Yeah, and that's been the moral of the story for thousands of years, right? We're going to figure out how to make a better mousetrap. We're going to figure out how to make a better car engine, and we're going to figure out how to continue as a society. It's complex problems, but we get to play a role. So hopefully this has been educational to everyone. I know it's been stimulating for me as I go back to my oil company tomorrow and think about what our role is. But we need everybody. We need all of this change that's ultimately a part of one conveyor belt of supply chain, moving us in hopefully a more positive direction. So oil and gas has been great while it's existed, and it'll be time for it to go in here in the next few decades.
Well, thanks, Kate, for sharing your honest opinions. Usually we're the pseudo scholars. I guess today a little bit different. You're really an energy expert in a lot of regards, and you come at this thing from a rational perspective, and from a perspective that I think like a lot of my left-leaning buddies in San Francisco maybe have never heard before. So I'll send the podcast their way.
Yeah, and one thing I think we also need to point out, Shane, is what's our next episode going to be on. So I want to just kind of whet the appetite of everyone, because like we said, we were doing a 2-part series here on transportation, but how about no cars at all? Say goodbye to Tesla.
This is where
That
things
could
get
be
really
the future that might even come at a faster rate than what Tesla's generating. So we're talking about self-driving vehicles. It's a technology that's happening. Google's doing it. Uber's doing it, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking that here in the next few days.
Yeah, that's going to be a great one. All right, Cade. Well, we'll see you for part 2 of the automobile revolution.
All right. See you, bro.